The Midway Atoll is a small group of volcanic islands located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Today it's home to about 40 scientists who study its unique birds and endangered marine life. But almost 80 years ago, the islands were home to some of the fiercest naval battles of World War II. Fought between the United States and Imperial Japan, the Battle of Midway is often referred to as a turning point for the Allies in the Pacific Theatre, a decisive blow to the Japanese Navy that turned the tide of war. So join us today as we explore the technology, the battle planning, and the little bit of luck that secured the Allies their historic victory in June 1942. To fully understand the Battle of Midway, it's important to understand what happened 7 months prior. In December of 1941, hoping to cripple the US Pacific Fleet in a preemptive strike, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii. Though the fighting only lasted 90 minutes, the United States suffered heavy losses, including 4 sunk battleships and nearly 200 aircraft lost and over 2,000 casualties. In the following days, the United States declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy, joining the Allied powers. There are several reasons that the US was so unprepared for an attack on Hawaii, but one of the main reasons was that their weapons, ammunition, and aircraft weren't on alert 24/7 for an impending raid, as they weren't yet officially at war with any nation. When the attack commenced, boats were docked and airplanes were like sitting ducks in hangars and runways, with sailors and pilots scrambling to get to their defensive positions. With comparatively light losses on the Japanese side, the attack was a significant morale boost for Japan, who had just seen the possibility of defeating the Americans and having unrivaled control over the Pacific. But with war officially declared, the United States war machine was now running at full speed. Of the 21 ships that were either sunk or damaged in the attack, all but 3 were later raised to repair them, and they were returned to service. The USS West Virginia, for example, was hit by 7 torpedoes, 2 bombs, and ultimately sank, but returned to service before the end of the war. The dockyards and oil reserves near Pearl Harbor weren't attacked in the raid, so many surviving aircraft were fixed up and readied within weeks. Another important note is that all 3 of the US Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, the Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise, were fortunately absent from Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack and were immediately ready for battle following the declaration of war. 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US struck back at Japan. Under the name Operation Doolittle, 16 B-25 bombers took off from an aircraft carrier and bombed strategic military targets in Tokyo and a few surrounding cities. 15 of the US bombers were destroyed in the raid, and the 16th had to emergency land in the Soviet Union, where it was promptly confiscated, though the crew was eventually returned to Allied territory. But despite the loss of aircraft and with minimal actual damage to Japanese resources, the attack was considered a success. It raised morale in the United States, and it exposed Japan's weak defenses around their main islands. But, most importantly, it pushed the Imperial Japanese Navy to strike back at the US and finalize their plans to attack Midway. At the head of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was growing continually anxious of just how quickly America's naval forces were growing. Knowing that given enough time, the US Navy would be simply too powerful to fight, Yamamoto reasoned that Japan needed to defeat the US Pacific Fleet as soon as possible in a decisive battle. But with defenses of Pearl Harbor at an all-time high, the Japanese were understandably hesitant to return. Instead, Midway Atoll was selected for this great battle, as it was assumed by the Japanese that the US would defend the islands with all their strength, but would be out of range of air support from the Hawaiian Islands, leaving US ships more vulnerable to Japanese torpedo bombers. The Japanese plan to invade Midway was rather complicated. The day before the attack on Midway, a separate Japanese force was to head north and invade the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. This was a supplementary attack to the main invasion of Midway, and was intended to both protect Japan from a flank through the northern Pacific, and to also have a launch point from which Japan could attack targets on the western US coast in the future. Some historians also believed that it was also intended to draw a large number of American forces away from Midway, further weakening the islands. The attack on Midway would come in 3 phases. The first phase was under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who, with his first carrier strike force, would sail towards Midway from the northwest and in the early hours of the morning would send hundreds of aircraft from several aircraft carriers to neutralize the defenses located on the islands. They were also instructed to avoid damaging the runways on the islands if possible, as the Japanese wanted to use them after occupying Midway. After the air attacks had eliminated much of the island's defenses, the second phase of the attack would approach Midway from the southwest, where transport ships would land approximately 5,000 troops on the beaches, who would extinguish any remaining resistance on the islands and take control of the airfields. Once the American forces stationed at Midway were neutralized by the first 2 phases, the first carrier strike force from the first phase would engage any reinforcements sent from nearby bases, and Admiral Yamamoto would be trailing behind the battle, ready to swoop in with Japan's most powerful battleships if he saw the need. After taking control of Midway, Japan would continue with the momentum of their victory, destroying the rest of the US Pacific Fleet and forcing a surrender. On paper, it seemed like a flawless attack. After all, the 3-phase offensive on the main islands from multiple directions, all while distracting the Americans in the north, couldn't possibly fail. But the Imperial Japanese Navy were working with a few disadvantages. Firstly, suspecting that the Allies were eavesdropping on their communications, the entire attack was to be carried out in strict radio silence. This meant that the separate strike forces would need to carry out their part of the attack with precision, all without any communication between groups. Also, the ground forces that were to take the islands would be doing so with almost no knowledge of their layout. In March of that year, just a few months before the battle, a reconnaissance plane was flown towards Midway in an attempt to take aerial photos of the island, but the plane was intercepted and shot down. Without these photos, the ground forces were going to have to rely on old, likely outdated maps of the layout of the island, and they had no real idea what number of troops awaited them. Lastly, the Japanese were under the assumption that the United States would not be expecting the attack, but they were wrong. Allied codebreakers had already been listening in on Japanese transmissions for months and had determined that the Japanese were preparing for their next naval offensive and were planning a Japanese invasion of a location codenamed AF. There was a lot of debate in the Navy as to the true meaning of AF, but Commander Joseph Rochefort of the US Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit was confident that he had solved the mystery. Earlier that year, 2 Japanese bombers were overheard saying that they had passed AF, and the only remarkable island anywhere near them was Midway Atoll. To prove this to his superiors, who were still skeptical that Midway was the next target, Midway was to send out a radio transmission in plain English saying that they were running low on water. Sure enough, intercepted Japanese transmissions showed reports that AF was low on water. With American military officials now aware that Midway was the next target of the full Japanese force, its defense became the Pacific's highest priority. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, was faced with some issues while planning his defense of Midway. A lot of his sailors and pilots were relatively new and had little to no combat experience, and much of the Navy's force was still recovering from the attack at Pearl Harbor. Knowing that he might be disadvantaged in both number and experience, Admiral Nimitz decided to use one of Japan's signature tactics against them: an ambush. That's right, a surprise attack on the surprise attack. The plan was to engage with the first phase strike group while their planes were away bombing the islands. With the Japanese forces separated into distant groups, the hope was that they would be too far away to support each other before arriving at Midway. This, combined with the advanced knowledge of the Japanese armada's location and arrival time, would give the Americans their best chance at repelling the invasion. The US mustered its forces as best it could. This consisted of 3 fleet carriers, 15 destroyers, 8 cruisers, 16 submarines, and over 350 aircraft deployed from either the carriers or the airfields of Midway. One of the carriers, the Yorktown, had been significantly damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor when a 250-pound bomb penetrated her deck before exploding, but her repairs were worked on overtime to prepare for the battle at Midway. By the beginning of June 1942, these forces had all arrived at their positions near the islands, narrowly missing the Japanese subs that had failed to detect the fleet and subsequently weren't able to warn Japan's attacking force. Along with the ships and the aircraft, American Marines had been transferred to the islands and had been hard at work setting up fortifications to defend from ground forces that would soon storm the beach. On the 3rd of June, a group of reconnaissance planes and 9 B-17 bombers spotted the naval force consisting of the transport ships and their warship support to the southwest of Midway. The bombers reported direct hits on 4 of the ships, though it was later revealed that none of them hit and no damage was done. At the same time, the Japanese forces in the north began their invasion of the Aleutian Islands. This battle, possibly deserving of its own video here on Warographics, is often known as the Forgotten Battle because it is overshadowed by the Battle of Midway and other major Pacific battles. As the US was aware of the simultaneous attack in Alaska and at Midway, they held back from sending their main fleet to the north, and a combined US and Canadian force fought fiercely to defend those islands. Now, back at Midway, the first phase of the invasion was underway. On the night of June the 3rd, Nagumo's first strike force had encountered heavy fog on its path to Midway from the northwest, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage. Nagumo was unable to fly reconnaissance planes ahead of his fleet, but on the other hand, he assumed that he still had the element of surprise on his side, and the fog would further hide his approach. It was at this time that Admiral Yamamoto, overseeing the invasion from the Yamato and his backup fleet a few hundred miles from Nagumo, noticed something rather strange. Though they hadn't broken the Allied code yet, Japanese intelligence had reported a sudden increase in American radio communication as their ships approached Midway. This indicated a possibility that the United States was already aware of the impending attack, but Yamamoto opted to maintain his strictly ordered radio silence and allowed the attack to continue. By 4:30 a.m. on the 4th of June, the fog had cleared, and Nagumo initiated the first attack, launching squadrons from his carriers to attack Midway. The first wave consisted of 108 aircraft, 36 Aichi D3A dive bombers, 36 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighter escorts. If you want to learn more about the Mitsubishi Zero, by the way, recently covered it over on my Mega Projects channel. Nagumo, always ready for the unexpected, had also reserved a few dozen aircraft on his carriers in case he needed them for defense against American ships. But with the fog cleared, American reconnaissance planes were able to spot an incoming threat. At 5:30, a high-altitude patrol plane caught a glimpse of the incoming ships through a break in the clouds, and 15 minutes later, a second reconnaissance pilot reported through his radio, "Many ships heading Midway." Not wanting to repeat mistakes made at Pearl Harbor, where so many aircraft had been destroyed before they could even get off the runway, all aircraft at Midway were ordered to start their engines and be prepared to take off at a moment's notice, and a squadron of B-17 bombers had been deployed to intercept the troop transports coming in from the southwest. Just before 6 a.m., Navy radar picked up its first signals of incoming enemy aircraft, placing them at 93 miles from Midway. Deployed reconnaissance pilots were ordered to find safer islands and avoid Midway upon return, and fighters took off to intercept the arriving Japanese planes and stop them from reaching Midway. Along with these aircraft, the bombers originally sent to attack the troop transports were ordered to change course and instead head to the northwest with the fighters, where they would bomb Nagumo's carrier fleet. From the start, the American fighters had the odds against them, with 2 aircraft far away on patrol when the orders were received and 1 aircraft with engine trouble. The squadron was down to 23 fighters, who needed to intercept over 70 bombers with 36 fighter escorts. Not only that, 20 of the American fighters were Brewster Buffalos, which had already been shown to be inferior in combat to the Japanese Zeros when in 1941 British and Dutch forces suffered substantial losses with them in Southeast Asia. In fact, United States Marines had already nicknamed the plane the Flying Coffin, and they were mostly Navy discards. Soon, several more planes took off from Midway, following closely behind the first group. At 6:15, Captain John F. Carey, flying an F-4F Wildcat, spotted the incoming aircraft below him through the clouds as the American fighters were flying at an altitude 3,000 feet higher than the Japanese formation. Nagumo's fleet had no radar capabilities, meaning that they were entirely unaware of the interceptors lurking above them, waiting to strike. Taking note that the escorting Zeros were flying above and behind the bombers, the American pilots went into steep dives, taking aim at the Japanese bombers. The ambush was initially successful, and several bombers were destroyed as the Buffalos suddenly emerged from cloud cover, firing their machine guns. But the tide quickly turned in favor of the Japanese. Mitsubishi Zeros were faster and more agile than Brewster Buffalos, and today they also outnumbered them. 16 American aircraft were quickly shot down as soon as the Japanese escorts moved to defend their bombers. Captain Carey was wounded and flew back to Midway using the clouds as cover, and ultimately survived. Major Parks, who had taken off just after the initial squadron, was forced to eject from his aircraft after it was damaged, but as he was parachuting towards a nearby island, he was fired at and killed by a Zero. Witnessing such a grisly death likely saved the life of another pilot, Captain Merrill. Captain Merrill's plane caught fire after being shot dozens of times, and he ejected from his plane at 8,000 feet once the heat from the flames reached his cabin. He delayed deploying his parachute until he had fallen quite far, landing in the ocean near Midway. Luckily, Navy torpedo boats had been deployed around the islands to pick up downed pilots, and he was quickly rescued. Overall, the fighters made to intercept the bombers had barely made a dent in the Japanese formation. With Midway's air support all but neutralized, the Marines stationed on the islands prepared to defend against the incoming bombers with anti-aircraft guns, and soon the Japanese Kate torpedo bombers reached the islands. The Kates, whose primary goal was to eliminate aircraft stationed on the islands, much like they did on Pearl Harbor, were surprised to find none on the island. Instead, they targeted their secondary objectives, anti-aircraft guns and other buildings and structures. The second wave of Japanese bombers, this time dive bombers who would target airfields, started their attack with something rather strange. According to Marines on the islands, the leading Japanese plane lowered to an altitude of just 100 feet and, turning upside down, flew slowly over the island in a show of bravado. Some even say that the pilot put his thumb to his nose. The confused troops stared at the plane for a few seconds before one Marine interrupted the show and shot it down. That was the only dive bomber destroyed in that raid. While the bombers did significant damage to the base at Midway, including destroying an anti-aircraft gun and hitting a few large oil tanks, causing a massive explosion on one of the islands, they did not damage the base to the point where it would be unusable. American bombers were still able to land, refuel, and rearm, and camouflage had protected many of the anti-aircraft guns from direct hits. The Zeros, who strafed the island after the bombers were finished, reported that there was still heavy anti-aircraft fire, and one of the pilots, Lieutenant Tomonaga, broke radio silence and announced to Nagumo that he was in need of a follow-up attack. At this time, the US fleet was cruising in to defend Midway, and Nagumo's fleet was under attack from several groups of American bombers that had taken off earlier from Midway. While most of these bombers didn't inflict significant damage, Nagumo himself was almost killed when a damaged B-26 narrowly missed ramming into the bridge of his ship before plummeting into the ocean. A squadron of obsolete Vindicator dive bombers, a few Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, 16 Dauntless dive bombers, and 15 B-17 heavy bombers made consecutive, desperate runs on the Japanese fleet. Almost all of these were shot down or heavily damaged by the dozens of Japanese fighters that had been deployed to circle and defend the fleet. One incredible story comes from a Dauntless dive bomber piloted by a young Ensign Earnest, who, after his plane was riddled with machine gun rounds and despite bleeding from his neck, single-handedly flew his badly damaged bomber without a compass until he was able to locate Midway from a thick column of smoke rising from the island. This flight was not only Ensign's first combat experience, but it was also his first time flying out of sight of land. These waves of attack by several types of bombers achieved very little in terms of physical damage to the Japanese fleet, but their influence in the battle was critical. They forced the fleet to engage in evasive maneuvers, spreading out and away from each other, and they played a critical role in causing Nagumo his first major error of the battle. As the first attacks on Midway had failed to remove all the defenses, the arriving transports would soon face heavy resistance from American Marines as they attempted to take the island, something they had not anticipated. Nagumo agreed that a second bombing run on Midway was necessary to pave the way for his troops, and ordered that the remaining Kate bombers on the carriers have their torpedoes removed and replaced with general-purpose bombs for a ground attack. But these bombers simply couldn't get airborne. With constant bombardment from American aircraft despite having no fighter escorts with them, Nagumo was forced to keep his carrier runways clear for refueling and rearming of his Zeros to defend the fleet, meaning that the remaining bombers were essentially stuck on the lower levels of the carrier. Suddenly, a patrol plane sent an alarming message to Nagumo. American warships had just been spotted about 200 miles away and approaching the Japanese fleet. Nagumo, now faced with a potential battle at sea, was forced to partially reverse his previous order, and he announced that the Kates, who had already been rearmed with regular bombs, could keep them, but the Kates, who had their torpedoes equipped, needed to stay that way. Nagumo was now faced with three problems: the urgency to launch a second attack on Midway, the need to defend his fleet from the incoming American ships, and to somehow recover all the aircraft who were returning from Midway and needed to be refueled and rearmed. This was overwhelming for Nagumo and his officers, who hadn't expected such a fearless resistance. His fears only grew when the patrol pilot radioed again that the American warships were also supported by an aircraft carrier. the USS Hornet. Realizing the danger that his fleet was in, Nagumo now ordered that every available bomber be equipped with torpedoes and prepared to attack the enemy fleet. The rest of his fighters were still circling over the fleet to protect the 4 aircraft carriers, which were now stuffed with fully fueled, fully armed, and therefore fully explosive aircraft. At about 8:30, while many of the bombers were still being armed with torpedoes below deck, the 70 or so remaining aircraft from the first bombing run on Midway had returned, and having not received clearance to land yet, most were circling the aircraft carriers, hoping to be cleared for landing before running out of fuel and having to ditch into the ocean, which a few of them had to do. Nagumo had to quickly decide whether to immediately send his bombers to the American fleet, which would delay the landing of the returning aircraft, or to wait and recover the returning aircraft, delaying the counterattack on the American warships. It was at this point that Nagumo made his next fatal error. Under pressure to make a quick decision, he ordered that instead of immediately launching the readied bombers on the approaching American fleet, each of his 4 carriers should instead receive the returning aircraft, both bombers and fighters, and prepare them to join the fight against the American warships. One of his main motivations for this order was witnessing how quickly the early attacks by American bombers were doomed without a fighter escort, stressing the need for his agile Zeros to accompany bombers on their way to the American fleet. At 9 a.m., the Japanese carriers had finished recovering the returning aircraft, and Nagumo decided that addressing the American fleet was of higher priority than a second bombing run on Midway, and ordered that his fleet turn sharply to the northwest and regroup in order to prepare for a massive attack on the American carrier and its escorting warships. All 4 carriers were now in a frenzy, hurrying to refuel, rearm, and repair their aircraft for the impending fight. If they could just gather their strength and launch their aircraft, this would be a victorious day for Japan. But unfortunately for Nagumo, the Americans also had some tricks up their sleeves and a bit of luck on their side. The first issue for Japan was their lack of knowledge of enemy movement. Without radar on their ships, they were relying heavily on reconnaissance planes to locate and identify enemy formations. In this case, the reconnaissance planes had failed to identify the 2nd and 3rd American aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise and the USS Yorktown. But this lack of knowledge was a downfall shared by both sides in the war. Knowing the time that Nagumo's fleet had attacked Midway, Rear Admirals Spurance and Fletcher estimated that around 8:30 a.m. the Japanese planes would be returning to their aircraft carriers, which would be an optimal time to strike the fleet. But they were operating under the assumption that the Japanese were unaware of the American fleet's proximity, and no one knew that Nagumo had changed course in anticipation of a naval battle. Without knowing this, torpedo bombers and escort fighters were launched from the Enterprise and the Hornet towards the anticipated location of the Japanese fleet, but arrived at nothing but open sea. This caused many of the planes to return to their carriers or fly onto Midway for refueling. Some logistical issues on the carriers had also given the US some trouble, as the recently trained and largely inexperienced crew spent time preparing each plane to be launched, meaning that Torpedo Squadron VT-8, a group of 15 Douglas Devastators, were launched well before their fighter escorts, who in the end failed to catch up with them. On their own, with no fighters for cover and flying even more old, obsolete bombers, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his squadron in a northwestern direction until they found Nagumo's fleet. Once again no match for the Zeros, his planes were all shot down before even a single torpedo was launched. This attack was followed by another squadron of torpedo bombers from the USS Yorktown, who, despite being escorted by fighters, were so heavily outnumbered that they didn't stand much of a chance, and all but 2 of these torpedo bombers were shot down. The squadron did manage to fire off some torpedoes, but they all either failed to detonate or were skillfully dodged by the Japanese ships. But these attacks, followed by consecutive, rather unorganized runs by other squadrons, achieved the same goal as before. They forced the carriers' decks to attend to refueling and rearming Zeros for defense, while their bombers sat helplessly below deck. At this point in the battle, 30 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise broke from their cloud cover above and began racing down towards 2 of the carriers. They, like many other squadrons, had gotten lost and were running low on fuel, but led by Wade McClusky, they managed to spot a Japanese cruiser and followed it back to the enemy fleet. In a break of luck, the Zeros that were supposed to be guarding the carriers were distracted by another squadron of torpedo bombers from the Yorktown, and McClusky and his squad didn't hesitate to seize the moment. Swooping down in their steep dive, they aimed their sights on the carrier Kaga. The crew on the Japanese carriers had been so hurriedly preparing aircraft that they, for one, weren't manning the anti-aircraft guns, and for two, they had left unequipped bombs lying in stacks instead of properly putting them in storage while they were refitting bombers with torpedoes. This spelled disaster for the Kager, who was defenseless against McClusky and his squad's bombs, which ravaged the Zeros on the upper deck and struck a gas canister. A fire soon broke out over the whole bridge, and as a witness later said, 10 minutes after the attack, I saw a large explosion amidship on the Kager. Rockets of flame, pieces of steel bolted upwards to about 3,000 or 4,000 feet high. At the same time, Lieutenant Best broke from McClusky's formation and flew with his wingman toward another carrier, the Akagi. Here, the pilots were again met with no resistance on their path to the ship, and 16 torpedo bombers from the Yorktown had reached a third carrier, the Soryu. In what seemed to be the blink of an eye, 3 of Japan's mighty carriers had been reduced to burning heaps. Nagumo's decision to keep the aircraft below deck and to hastily change their ammunition had essentially turned the ships into floating barrels of gunpowder, just sitting there, waiting for a match to be lit. By that evening, all 3 carriers had sunk into the ocean. But the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, who had been separated from the others during evasive maneuvers, was outraged at the loss of the other ships and immediately struck back. After the American bombers reversed course to return to their carriers, the Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers with 6 Zero escorts to follow them. When radar picked up the incoming threat, many of the dive bombers were intercepted and shot down by fighters, but a few got through the ship's defenses, and 3 hits were recorded on the USS Yorktown. 2 exploded on the deck, causing minimal damage, but the third penetrated the deck and disabled the ship's boilers, leaving her practically immobile. But as the Hiryu prepared to launch its second attack on the Yorktown, the crew had worked frantically to get the slip in working order, and they were able to get it functional again after a few hours. Just before launching the next wave of torpedo bombers to attack the Yorktown, Admiral Yamaguchi finally received the news that there were not 1, but 3 American carriers in the vicinity. Despite this, with no regard to the well-being of his ship or his men, he ordered the attacks to continue. The second attack, despite encountering heavy anti-aircraft artillery and defensive fighters, was successful in sinking the Yorktown with several torpedoes, leaving its commanding officer with no choice but to order his crew to abandon ship. When just a few aircraft from this attack returned in one piece, the Hiryu, against all odds, decided to wait until nightfall to launch yet another attack on the remaining American carriers. But they would never get the chance. Determined to avenge the Yorktown, the Enterprise and the Hornet were bent on sinking the Hiryu and launched a combined 40 dive bombers to locate and destroy it. At 5 p.m. they found it, and while the other aircraft distracted the escorting warships, 13 bombers trained their sights on the carrier, dropped their bombs, and left the ship completely in flames. Though the ship could still move, the fires were spreading and out of hands, and the crew was certain that the ship was going to sink. Yamaguchi ordered his men to abandon ship and opted to remain on board and die with his carrier. Knowing the ship was unsalvageable, nearby Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes on their last carrier and left it to be claimed by the Pacific. Back in the main fleet, who had been too far away to help Nagumo, Admiral Yamamoto realized that he needed to take his last chance to cripple the American fleet and capture Midway Island. Deciding that a nighttime raid would be most effective, during the early hours of June the 5th, Yamamoto was once again outsmarted when the Americans, who had anticipated a follow-up attack during the night, had temporarily withdrawn their forces to the east. Seeing that his quick plan had failed, he called off the entire attack on Midway and began retreating. But this wouldn't be the last of their misfortunes that day. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, had been deployed to approach Midway and fire at the airfields. When the operation was suddenly cancelled by Yamamoto, they began retreating at full speed when they spotted an American submarine chasing them and prepared to fire torpedoes. Taking evasive maneuvers in the dark while attempting to dodge torpedoes, the 2 ships collided with each other, causing serious damage and slowing the ships down. The Japanese Navy sent 2 destroyers to escort the wounded ships and full steamed back to Japanese waters. Seeing these 2 heavy cruisers as sitting ducks, the Enterprise and the Hornet launched 3 bombing runs on them, which succeeded in sinking the Mikuma. When the fighting seemed to be over, the Americans returned to the site where the Yorktown was bombed, and they were shocked to find her still floating. In the hopes that she could be repaired, a tugboat and several destroyers began pulling the flooded carrier back to Hawaii. But this commotion caught the attention of a Japanese reconnaissance plane, and eager to avenge their lost carriers, a submarine was deployed which successfully sunk the Yorktown and one of its destroyer escorts as it was being towed back to Pearl Harbor. Nearly 40 Japanese men were taken prisoner from the Battle of Midway and were held at Pearl Harbor until the end of the war, while the 3 US airmen captured by the Japanese were all brutally executed. The Battle of Midway was a colossal defeat for the Japanese Navy. Without even achieving their goals of the operation, they lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 300 aircraft, and hundreds of trained pilots, sailors, and repairmen. The military was so ashamed of the defeat that they hid news of it from the public and even isolated survivors of the campaign from their families. So, what went wrong in the attack? And how could it have ended differently? For starters, the Japanese plan of attack was overly complex. Splitting the attacking fleets into multiple groups had served only to isolate them from each other. Secondly, the Japanese were working under too many assumptions, one of which was that the Americans were going to be caught off guard by the attack on Midway. This wouldn't have had such an impact if the groups hadn't been under such strict radio silence for the first critical hours of the battle. And from the scattered American fighter responses, they could have probably figured out that the Americans were prepared. The Japanese were also surprised by the courage and determination of American pilots. As they had been told the Americans would be cowardly and weak in combat, it must have been a shock to see squadrons of torpedo bombers fly straight at Nagumo's fleet without any fighter escorts, the courageous act that forced Nagumo's hand in keeping his decks busy for his fighters. The battle could have turned out very differently if the Japanese had put their full force in attacking Midway. Yamamoto, for instance, didn't even see combat during the Battle of Midway, as he was hundreds of miles from the fighting, but he was aboard the Yamato, which, along with her sister ship, the Musashi, was the heaviest battleship ever constructed, and could have led the reserve fleet to victory if they'd teamed up with Nagumo. Instead, confident that Nagumo would defeat the US fleet, he had stayed back until it was too late to interfere. If Japan had defeated the US fleet defending Midway, they would have had a foothold in the middle of the Pacific, from which they could have pressed forward towards Hawaii. In more recent years, some of the sunken ships from the battle have been located. The Yorktown was found in 1998 at a depth of 16,000 feet, surprisingly intact, and in 2019 the wreckage of the 2 Japanese carriers, the Akagi and the Kaiga, were found at a depth of 18,000 feet. Overall, with such devastating losses, Japan's navy was permanently weakened, and they struggled to replace the experienced servicemen that had been killed. The Battle of Midway showed the importance of wartime intelligence and code breaking, and the dangers of overconfidence and unnecessary complexity. Crippling the Japanese fleet at Midway, along with a few other victories in the following months, such as the Guadalcanal Campaign, gave the US the momentum it needed to push back and take the upper hand. For the remainder of the war, Japan never launched another major attack in the Pacific, playing a desperate defense until their surrender in 1945. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe. If you've got a suggestion for a future War or Graphics video, please use the comment section below. And as always, I'll see you next time.